Vote Common Good daily podcast and live stream. Doug Padgett here. I am super excited about today, and partly because you're all watching and because you're listening. And so good to see you. And as the old joke goes around here, good to be seen by you and good to be heard by you. So thanks for being with us. You can see that we have a collection of guests, a professor of religion and two filmmakers and a Vote Common Good host. I mean, who could ask for a better Thursday morning? See, on Thursdays around here at Vote Common Good, we turn our daily podcast to certain issues and topics that we think really matter in the world that we live in. And we're always trying to bring this hopeful, open-eyed view toward the world and asking the question, what's going on in our world and what can we do about it and how can we engage? And the issue of the environment, it's a really big issue. So if you wonder what we're talking about today, the Butler documentary film crew, of whom Catherine and Janine are the principals, put together a documentary with Curtis Schaefer on how did religion and how did religious people, especially religious leaders, move against the environment when it seems like something that to many of us, and me as a pastor and as an activist in religion and civic life, you just sort of ask yourself, like, who's against the environment and why would people be arguing against environmentalism? Well, we're going to get to the bottom of that question and talk a bit about that today. So, Catherine, Janine, Curtis, thanks for being on with us this morning so bright and early. Why don't you tell us a little bit? Just give us a little recap of who you are, what you do, how you live in the world. Curtis, would you mind going first?
Sure. Yeah, my name's Curtis Schaefer, and I teach at the University of Virginia, where I've worked as a professor for 16 years. And in my day job, I'm a student and teacher of Tibetan Buddhism and the religions of Asia. I tend to be high in the mountains when I'm over in Asia. I also run something called the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, which looks at the intersection of racism, the history of racism, and contemporary politics, both here in the U.S. and around the world. And it's in this context that I got to know Janine and Catherine Butler, and we ended up making this film together.
Well, good morning. And it looks like, for those who are able to watch this, that you're into guitars and music too. So the background for those just on the podcast is you've got a collection of guitars and recording equipment. So you have a musical mind, right? Huh? Yeah.
I'm sure somebody else has a room like this out there too.
I'm sure they do. Hey, Catherine, thanks for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Good morning from California.
Great.
Well, I can just briefly say that I have had an enormous pleasure producing documentaries with my sister for almost 20 years, together and apart. And we've traveled the world and helped tell stories that were kind of bridge building stories, that hope is always a thread that runs through it, trying to gather as many diverse voices in a community to look at old things in a new way. And it was a pleasure working with Curtis and his team at the lab. It was really fun when they came to us and said, what about doing a film like this? We had met them over through our first film that we met him on was American Heretics, Politics of the Gospel, where we met Doug and Telluride. And it's just brought a tremendous group of people into our orbit that have been really anxious to share their stories and ask us to help them tell theirs. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, I'll tell you, it's fun for me. I like both of you personally, but I'm a big fan of documentary filmmakers, like so many people are. You people are magic, and actually have made COVID survivable from a like learning and entertainment side. So thanks for all that. And Janine, you're part of the sister duo that makes these great films.
Yes, I am. So it's kind of everything Catherine just said. We've been at it for a while, and I like the fact that you call documentary filmmakers magic. I mean, we think sometimes it's a little more like, the sausage making. You don't want to see what goes on behind the scenes. So it's good to hear magic. And as Catherine said, we met Curtis and his team at UVA in the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab through American Heretics screening, I guess last year maybe. And so when they came back around with this subject, we were so excited by their approach to being open to kind of looking at this very in-depth subject, which could have gone a lot of different ways. We could have stayed very focused on just one aspect for 20 minutes, and 20 minutes was a push for a short. But their team was kind of excited and open to the possibility of hitting on a few different things that interact between environmental issues, religion, race, and politics, so that maybe it's a launching point to talk about, for people to go in depth and learn more about it and look at this issue in a new way. And we really learned a lot about the influences that have been cooking around the issues of the environment for decades and decades and decades, all kind of under our nose in our lifetime, and how influential some of the events have been in shaping policies that we're all living with today. And I think now, even now, it's like I can go forward in a more informed way just by being able to dig into these topics. So for that, we thank UVA and Curtis and his team.
Well, I am so excited that we get to talk about this, all of it, because these issues that you've raised are incredibly important. That the world we live in didn't just happen, right? The world we live in is not following just a natural set of evolutionary forces. It's people making decisions and choices and doing particular things. And this 20-minute documentary on the role of Christian faith, especially Christian faith leaders in the United States, and how environmentalism became an anti-approach to that issue is really fascinating. So I'm so glad we get to talk about it. And I just want to remind people, if they're following along on our podcast, that there's a video version of all of this. So if you're a podcast listener, I want you to know that over at Vote Common Good on Facebook, you can follow us. And if those of you who are watching on Facebook have thought, you know what I want to do? I want to watch this on my phone on Twitter. Well, we also broadcast all of these live on Twitter. And we even are over at Twitch. So if Twitch is a thing you're into because you're a gamer, I don't know, all three of you, if you know about Twitch, but Twitch is an entire other arena of video connection that people are into. And we also stream over on Instagram, and we do it on YouTube. And if you're at all willing to go to YouTube, go to the Vote Common Good channel at youtube.com/c/VoteCommonGood and subscribe to our channel. It really helps. Like, YouTube is built around subscriptions. It doesn't cost you anything, but it really benefits us. So if you're willing to subscribe to our podcast and live stream over there, we'd love to have you do that. And of course, also, if you're listening to this, subscribe to the podcast, because that also is something that really helps us when that happens. And when you do, you're going to find out that on Mondays, we talk about news updates. We call it Common Good News on Mondays. And on Tuesdays, we turn our attention to politics. Rob Ryerson and I talk with politicians and people in the faith spaces about how politics can be about the common good and not just about our political partisan separations. On Wednesdays, we turn our attention to faith, and Laura Truax, Stephanie Spalding, and Dominique Gilliard and I host a conversation around the particular implications of faith for the common good in the world that we live in. Thursdays, we talk about particular issues. And on Fridays, we turn our attention to science with an astrophysicist who's the co-host. So a lot of things happening in our world, and we'd love to have all of you feel like you can connect to it and that you can be part of it with all the rest of us. So, all right, well, let's get into this fun topic for the day. I had a chance to watch this film. Thank you for sending your email out promoting it, and I was thrilled. Big fan of your other work, American Heretics, which I'm sure we can talk about as we go. But this film really kind of captured my imagination, and it's called God and Green. And someone had the clever idea to use the $ as the ampersand sign. So I think that's fantastic. So if you're able to watch this on the video, you can see that they have created this graphic that really says there's some connection between dollars and the environment and religion. And what you describe it as is the story of how potent forces came together to mount an army of climate change skeptics in the name of God, country, and capitalism. I mean, well done, y'all. Very compelling. And it kind of gets at this thing that so many of us thought was happening, right? Like, is there some sort of a intentional approach to saying to people of Christian faith in America, you should oppose climate and you should oppose the environment, and you should be on the other side of this political issue, and you all get right at it. So I'll play the little teaser that's the first minute of the documentary, and I think it would give people a really good flavor.
This is a story about today that started yesterday and impacts tomorrow.
Hi, I'm Nancy Pelosi, lifelong Democrat and Speaker of the House.
And I'm Newt Gingrich, lifelong Republican, and I used to be Speaker.
We don't always see eye to eye.
But we do agree our country must take action to address climate change.
Together, we can do this.
We couldn't be further apart. I'm on the left.
And I'm usually right. And we strongly disagree.
Except on one issue. Tell them what it is, Reverend Pat.
That would be our planet. Taking care of it is extremely important.
We all need to work together, liberals and conservatives.
All right, so the whole thing starts out with this like walk down memory lane. I remembered after watching this video, this documentary, I remember those commercials, like this campaign where it was, Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich sitting on a bench saying, "We all care about the environment. Let's come together." And then, of course, you were smart enough to include Al Sharpton and Pat Robertson. And so were they in the campaign when they were pushing this idea. They said, you know what, we have to include religious people. So let's get public, political, religious figures and let them say we disagree on a lot, but we're together on this. There was a movement at one time, or at least a marketing campaign, if not a movement, to make this possible. What? Tell me a little bit about what happened. Who wants to sort of do the quick? I don't want you to ruin the documentary. People should watch it. But what happened? Like, how did this come about?
All I'll say to that is, if you're going to keep watching, do like a little like ... and then, and then how did they go from actually agreeing on this to being polar opposites for years and years and years? And that's a little bit of what the short goes into. It's like, what were the causes that happened? And there are many. So it goes from science denial to political partisanship to fossil fuel companies having a long arm back in history in terms of shaping the conversation. That's my bit. Curtis, Catherine?
Curtis, you working at the, as a professor of religion at the University of Virginia, you had particular interest in this and apparently pitched this notion and idea like, hey, we should tell this part of the story. Why did you want to tell that part of the story? And what is the recap of the story as you tell it to people, when you're at a cocktail party, if people did such things anymore?
So I have a lifetime in religious studies, and so I'm fortunate to get the chance to see how impactful religion, both as a system of ideas and practices, but also a culture and a real driver of social life, can really influence everything in our daily lives, right? Regardless of whether we're affiliated with a church or a particular tradition or not. Everything from what we eat to what we watch to how we interact with other people. And so we spent a lot of time asking ourselves at the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab how religion impacts our current political conversations in particular. And we knew that religion was a big part of the story of how public perceptions of climate change have transformed over the past 2 decades. And we also knew that money, that big business was a huge part of it too. So we were reading a book called Merchants of Doubt by an historian of science, Naomi Oreskes. There's also a wonderful documentary of the same name,
called Merchants of Doubt. That's
Merchants
a great
of
phrase.
Doubt, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's the story of how the smoking industry destabilized public trust in emerging science about the negative effects of smoking on health, not just lung health, but all manner of health issues. And it was a concerted attempt over a couple of decades that this happened earlier than the climate change issue, but it was so effective the way that they utilized fringe science and sowed doubt in public perceptions of the both the ways that science works and also the claims that science makes. That the people in climate denial world, they really took their playbook from that. And so we wanted that to be a part of that story as well.
Like, is that something you've been able to document, that the same organizers who moved against climate became climate deniers? Did they really?
Well,
like,
it's not the
is
same.
it just
It's
sort
not
of like
the
they
same
acted the same
people.
way? Or
Yeah.
okay, that's what
It's
I'm
acted
wondering.
the same way. Yeah, it just was
They
so
acted the same way.
effective, right? So science doubt. There's a real sense in which it was the tobacco industry that really created that as a political strategy to sow doubt. Yeah. So
Now,
I'm sure we
I
can
think
find
this
other
is
places where it's used, Tim.
Well, yeah, and I think this is a really interesting part of the conversation because, we're now living in this period where a lot of us are concerned about conspiracy theories, right? Whether it be QAnon or any of the other dangerous ones that lead to people believing that there's some big cabal of powerful forces coming together in the background that you don't see. And then they describe how people are being impacted by that and then give people a charge that can lead to real dangerous actions like an insurrection at the Capitol or gun shootings or other violent activities. And conspiracy theories are problematic when they are not true and are giving people an explanation for something that happened by saying there's a conspiracy of actors in the background. But on the other hand, sometimes there's a conspiracy of actors in the background, right? that are that are doing things, and sometimes it's a conspiracy of love and goodness, right? It's a coalition of people working together, and they want to be public and they want it to be out there. And it seems to me the difference between a conspiracy and a coalition is: do you want people to know about it? Like if you're covering it up, and you don't want people to find out that you exchanged emails and phone calls and you had meetings and you did things. Well, that's a conspiracy, right? Because you're trying to do something nefarious. You're trying to do something harmful versus people doing something positive. So we all know that, people join together in lobbying groups and action groups. They function in the world. But then there's something more nefarious that goes on in the background to try to get people to believe something that's not true or that they wouldn't otherwise believe if they had other information, right? Feels to me, and we just talked 2 days ago with somebody who specializes in conspiracy theories and trying to understand what these are. And I was thinking a lot about this conversation, right? Because what you've exposed is, there were people with very direct interests, financial interests, worldview interests, personal grudges, that all came together to say, let's move public opinion among faith voters and faith leaders so that they oppose climate change. Do I sort of have that right? Like, is that a decent explanation about what went on? And you all aren't like when you're a documentary. So I guess Catherine and Janine, this is for you. As documentary filmmakers, you must be thinking all the time, like, how do you tell the truth of a story? Because as documentarians, you want to expose the truth of a situation to people. In this age of heightened concern about conspiracy theories and power of that narrative in our society, do you think about that? Do you worry about that? Did that impact how you told this story of the last 25 years and how this particular issue was shifted and changed?
I would say we think about that all the time. And certainly the stories that we have, been able to tell, and this one in particular, I think that's why we were so happy to use that Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat itself, it only rhymes, because the same kind of actions, the same kind of trying to control the narrative, but if you ground it in kind of a historical and entertaining, this has happened before. This isn't this isn't a brand new nefarious conspiracy from outer space. This is a kind of a well-known playbook. It's like Curtis said, while the early players, in the oil industry were supporting the, pushing against science because they were also pushing their own Christian worldview, in the early time, the very early John B. Rockefellers, not necessarily thinking that they were doing anything, that was going to lead to someone very wisely taking that playbook and applying it directly like a concerted propaganda campaign, against that climate science even exists right now. It's just using, you're really talking about the same playbook as Curtis said, is the tobacco industry who went and hired, the best Madison Avenue ad guys they could get and started controlling the narrative. And so when you're a documentarian, hopefully you have, you're not just representing one interest, you're trying to include as many voices. As like Janine and I, we said, well, we don't know, we need to go out and ask. And so that's why you have all these wonderful characters in our story who are, we went out and asked them, well, they're in the community that's part of this story. Like, how did this happen? We don't pretend to be the, the experts on this. We're trying to say, wait, let's all look at this and sort of let you decide. Is there something a little off here?
All right. So before we go down all the routes of what the content was, Curtis, I'm interested in you raised the idea with Catherine and Janine being filmmakers and documentary filmmakers that there's a story to tell here. Why did you want to tell the story in film fashion, especially in this short film, which I think is a great idea? When I first saw that this was 20 minutes, it was this great relief because I thought when I saw that there was this great documentary called God and Green and the role of this coming together of faith and power brokers, I thought, okay, I'm going to have to like slot an hour and a half into my day, at some point. It now started to compete with my evening entertainment. And when I saw that it was 20 minutes, I literally thought, I have 20 minutes right now. So I don't know, within minutes of getting the email, I followed through and clicked on the link, which we'll put in the show notes and all the rest here, and watched it. And it was something great about it being 20 minutes long that allowed me to do it. So Curtis, your idea of, I want to tell this story about how the same thing that happened with the tobacco industry now has been happening with faith leaders as a way to deny climate change. Why did you say that should be told? Why did you think that should be told through a film? And how did you get to 20 minutes?
It's both. Film is both efficient and dense. So it's efficient because it doesn't take a long time, right? You can tell a complex story in 20 minutes if you're good at it, like the Butlers are. And so that efficiency and the density, right? You've got the ability to stack on top of each other image which is both evocative and instructional, diagrams and charts, and audio. So you're working with a polyphony in film that you don't have in writing.
That's a great word, by the way, polyphony. I've never heard that word. That is
a real great example of that is, I had read so much trying to understand the housing crash in the late zeros, and I just really didn't get it. I'm not an economist, so there was kind of limits there. But I heard of This American Life story, which basically just followed the money, and it was a narrative form. And I learned more about the entire crash than any other piece of writing, than from any other piece of writing. And I thought, though, there's a lesson right there. So as part of what we're interested in is the power of storytelling to convey complex stories with multiple perspectives. After we saw American Heretics, Butler's long form film, we saw in that a real care to integrate history and a really gripping contemporary story, with real meaning for people now. And we thought that's going to be a great way to do this.
Yeah, that's so insightful. And you chose, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you said that, documentary filmmakers have a kind of magic that they use. And to me, what was magic was seeing them out of the many ideas, too many ideas that we brought them, and the people that we suggested, they created this really powerful combination of 8 primary characters, which I think was a lot for 20 minutes, but it really works too. Yeah.
So tell people where they can see it. People in the chats are saying, "Hey, I'm so anxious to see this." Other people are saying, "I've watched it." It's on the website, available at the website at the University of Virginia.
It's available for free at the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab website, Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab. Yep. And I'm sure we can provide you a link you can post out.
Yeah, we'll throw
later
links in
too.
there.
But
Yeah,
if you
we'll put it in the
keyword
show
Religion,
notes.
Race, and Democracy Lab Virginia, you'll find it. Yeah.
And the film has this animated sense to it. We saw it in the little clip that we started with, and it was really a smart way and sort of a fun way to bring this complex history back together. That there were all of these interweaving stories, because it's a complicated story over a number of decades that moved faith people into believing that this was a problem. So there's this sort of a tale being told, which I thought was really interesting. Catherine, Jean, you want to talk a little bit about that decision to use kind of animation and the like to move the story along through the history?
Sure, I'll take that one. One, we produced this at the beginning of, not the beginning, I guess. We started to be in production during the first half of the pandemic. So we knew that, and so our interviews, I should do a shout out to all of our characters, that they were willing to set up a camera that our DP sent to them and like get sort of film themselves, and I would talk to them through Zoom, and that's how our interviews were done. And then we knew also that we'd be relying on stock and archival footage, but also we thought animation would be a great way to bring some of these stories up. And we have this, this amazing team. Our animator with the paintings and stuff is Fun Jacket, and our editor Jamie Godfrey. They really work together to, just bring these concepts to life. And Jamie, our editor, always likes to call some of Drew's work from Fun Jacket, he's got little Easter eggs hidden in his animation and paintings. And if you watch it a few times, or you start seeing little messages that he embeds in his work that might relate to an oil drill or environmental justice issues or fires caused by global warming. And so we have a lot of fun with it. And I just encourage people that if you do want to watch it, like, take some time and really look at some of that artwork, because it's just, they're very clever. And it's what goes to what Curtis was saying, where you can, with film, you can add all these layers. So you can be telling stories on top of the story with your, not just with the images that you're using, but within the artwork, with the music that you choose. You're sort of, it's kind of like all the ingredients that go into a cake. And so the animation for us was a lot of fun. It was fun to create and watch it come together. And
well, it's a really powerful way to tell the story. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the story itself. What happened? I had thought, and this documentary helped me a lot, that what happened was Al Gore came out and said the environment's a problem. Environmental change is a problem. And there was a big movement against Democrats and by Republicans, and so many religious people identify first as a Republican and then later politically in any other way. And so it just became a red versus blue fight. And I kind of thought, well, that's the best explanation. And that is an explanation that's in there, right? But it's not the only explanation, which I think is the powerful part of this story, is it wasn't just individual people being moved because of political sidism. it was so okay, let's talk a little bit about that, and then we can talk about some of the other factors that the characters exposed about what was going on with this. There was just a bare-knuckled political, like, hey, we're going to use environment as a wedge issue for voters. Curtis, what was going on with that as you've looked at religion in America and its power? What went into making the decision?
There's a funny sense in which the climate issue was a little bit along for the ride, along with a host of other dividing line issues, civil union, abortion, right to take the more kind of local, personal, interpersonal issues, and perspectives on property ownership, perspectives on regulation, right? The more kind of social, communal things. And one of the things that we really found fascinating was that it wasn't always like it is now, right? It doesn't have to be like it is now, but and the film starts out so wonderfully with those two ads with Pelosi and Gingrich and Sharpton and Buchanan, right? It's like this was not a divisive issue for at least for that moment, right? Not exclusively a divisive issue, right? That happens several years later when it really becomes bundled with larger moral majority issues, and it really becomes a way one of a host of issues to bind together dedicated Republican voting groups. And so it's that transformation in the later 2000s that we were really interested in terms of present history.
When
there's
was
a
that
longer
campaign
story
put out? That campaign of, hey, we're on different sides politically.
That's 2008, 2009, and you see by the 2014, the early teens, right, that it's just right, yeah.
I mean, so
God
really
controls the climate, right?
Yes,
there's nothing
really
that
in
we
short
can,
order.
Nothing we can do about
this
that.
This wasn't one of these like 40 years it took to make this shift. Somewhere between 2008 and 2009 and 2014, which people that follow politics and say that was also the time of the Tea Party takeover. Like there was a whole thing inside of Republicanism that went on, and that Tea Party movement came out of certain states. And you only touch on this a little bit, but like oil drilling states, right? It came out of Oklahoma and Texas and places where there were powerful interests that thought a lot about the future of the oil industry, and that's the other piece of it, right? That oil and people that had investment in oil that were also religious, and that was the piece that was so revolutionary or revealing to me, is that there were these like just rich, powerful oil operating families that just also happened to be religious in a very conservative kind of religious way. And like every citizen in the country, they want to influence, with the power that they have. So they had money and they had oil industry. And that kind of came together in this weird mashup where they needed to create a theology that went along with their business practice, not very reminiscent of how the Christians in the South in the United States in the 1850s had to create a religion and a religious argument for slavery that produced a new kind of race theory and how God would divide the races and so on, because they had a business model that needed justification. So the capitalism side said to the church, we need to re-understand our theology of, humanity to do so. And it seemed to me, and Curtis, you're the expert on this, but it seemed to me that this was also something that was going on in this movement in the sort of middle 2000s, that there was an aggressive theological reconsideration being put together to explain why extracting oil from the ground is the best way for us to continue to function our democracy and our capitalism.
Yeah, well, the expert on that story, which is that's actually a longer term story, is a fellow named Darren Dochuk, who's a professor of history at Notre Dame, and he's one of the characters in the film. And I think probably every character we have a lot more interview tape, and we wanted to include more.
Yeah.
Right, that's a part of the tragedy of creating something like this.
But don't forget what you guys did do at the lab was on your website, you can read the full interviews from our characters, so you can get a little more in depth. But also with his, he wrote a book called Anointed with Oil. I think it's Anointed with Oil, and it's fascinating read. I mean, it's just fascinating. Great. Yeah, it's really good in terms of if you're really interested in that particular area of the conversation.
So you
and
start
Doug,
to
in
see,
answer to your question,
yeah, go ahead.
What Darren Dochuk does is he charts two tales. One is the rise of oil and a kind of the creation of a civil religion, and the other is oil that he calls wildcat Christianity, which is much more about local authority, laced with the distrust of big government, right? And those two play off each other for the better part of the 20th century. And wildcat Christianity comes to have a real kind of cultural, emotional hold over, Darren Dochuk would say, over evangelicals today. Yeah.
Yeah, that was such an
out west
provocative
ethos,
phrase.
yeah?
Yes, right, and that is still what that shows up, literally today. The documentary says this is a tale of what happened, in the past, what's happening now, what's happening in the future, and man, that version of Christianity, that he refers to as a wildcat, which is a phrase, that comes from industry. And that is what's happening, that there's this like Wild West renegade kind of capitalism, that's fueled on by an Ayn Rand kind of libertarianism for people that are into the political theories. They kind of get behind all this. And that crowd just wanted there to be no regulation on human interaction when it came to providing for our capitalism, right? Like don't restrain. Just be free, and that meant free. And they, obviously, these the kind of republicanism that is pushed for freedom from government on all things. That has been around our American worldview for a long, long time. But it got mixed with a kind of civil religion, as you mentioned it, Curtis, and a kind of like Christian nationalism that feels like it created a new variant. It almost feels like when we talk about the coronavirus that there's these new variants that come out that the vaccine might not be as potent against. Like we had vaccines in our society to prevent certain strains from having its power, and a new variant came in the middle 2000s in this thinking, this kind of virus in our thinking that just spread like a virus around. It went viral, right? And got into all kinds of thinking that all of a sudden people were saying just things about the environment that was seemed wacky. Now, I will say this, and I'd be interested in your thoughts. There's also people who say on the climate change and the climate and the environment needs to be a top issue in our society. There's a kind of apocalyptic world that gets talked about in that realm too, right? For the people that view the environment the way that I do, sort of on my progressive side of this, that I think spooks a lot of people, right? Where they just talk about, there was peak oil and there's going to be a crashing of the economy, and there was going to be we're going to lose the world. The human race will not survive. Like there's a strong apocalyptic narrative, right? And it felt to me like what happened was religious people like to talk about apocalypse and they don't want other people stepping on their territory. And so now there were competing apocalyptic narratives that were happening. Did you get any of that? Like I know you interviewed some people that did, they said like, hey, I was a climate denier and now I'm not. And one person was a congressman. But is there anything in that the the environment is in crisis crowd also changed tack in this same period of time in a way that also caused to some of this increased division?
Oh gosh, that's a very interesting question. I think
That
it's
is.
complicated, but I think the overriding theme, and please you guys jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, um, is that the distrust of what's called as the elites, the
Mhm.
sort of natural distrust that's always been kind of in that kind of wildcat, don't tell us what to do, distrust of authority, distrust of institutions, plays really nicely with the apocalyptic narrative as well. And I think that that really has gotten amped up. They specifically went after the early climate scientists on their data, and they were kind of throwing epithets at them as if they were just snobbish elites that were trying to control them. This isn't true because God creates the climate. God controls the climate. What do they know? So I think it's very complicated, but the distrust, that core tenet of distrust has been
Mm.
kind of using your viral has been an immense booster, you know,
Nice.
spreading,
Nice.
whatever kind of theory there might be.
Yeah, I agree with Kath. I think, and from the people the experts that do that think about this and study this, that we came away from them with the message of maybe not its competition for the apocalyptic narrative, but it in certain areas it was also about man's hubris, like the arrogance of the scientists, the arrogance of the elites, to think that man could control the climate because, as the guy in the film says at the top, God controls the climate. And that and maybe while the leadership might not have believed that, that was something that they were able to organize and sort of feed to their flocks and the masses and kind of gin up that distrust that Catherine talked about, or the separation. And I think the other thing to remember, and it doesn't as much have to do with the apocalyptic, is one thing that we keep getting reminded of is that it was also about organizing a committed block of voters to have a very big influence and voice at the voting booth. And while that might be diminishing a little in terms of the religious right, it might be diminishing a little bit. It's still worth remembering that these conversations, these ideas about bundling the environment into some of the larger issues or even the wedge issues that wanted to be voted on was just sort of a brilliant strategy among leadership who wanted certain things not to happen on the political front, deregulation, things like that. And so, I mean, I like your concept of the apocalypse. Nobody wants to, this is our apocalyptic narrative. Maybe that's something we should research further.
Yeah, that God's going to destroy the world. We're not going to destroy the world, right? That's God's doing. I think it really does drive a lot of not the facts or anything, but it kind of the deep down sense of that human beings are only have so much power. I mean, I think I heard video of Rush Limbaugh saying stuff like that in the 2000s, right? Like, who do you think you are that you could control? The planet's been around for millions of years, and what we're going to do in 6 years, 10 years is not enough to make change. And then climate scientists are like, no, let us show you about the rising temperatures and how we made changes to our policies and to our regulations, and the ozone layer that was a problem 30 and 40 years ago is not the same kind of problem now. Like, we can literally make changes in what we do as human beings, and that has impact on the planet. And it's just such a curious thing. I haven't been a working pastor for so many years. Like, the environment feels overwhelming to people, right? That like as a topic, and the idea that like what I'm going to do is like turn the water off when I'm brushing my teeth, and that's the interventions that a human being can do, or I'm going to take the bus instead of my car, or I'm going to change out my light bulbs to a more efficient kind, feels like, oh, you got to be kidding me. Like, that's going to be the answer. And so I don't know, there seems like there's something in the environmental call to human engagement that I can see that feeds into someone thinking that's not really how this changes. Right? Like that's not going to be enough. I sure hope that's not it. And so I think there's kind of a sense of people feeling really disempowered. And so if someone can come along and give you a narrative that says, yeah, don't worry about it. It's not you. Like you're not the problem in this scenario.
Right. It's brilliant.
Yeah, it's kind of a smart play. Tell us the story about the congressman. It's such a fun story, and I think people will want to hear this one. Who wants to recap the congressman who said, "I'm totally against the environment" and didn't know anything about it?
I think Janine, because she had a great conversation with Bob, and
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So Bob Inglis was decided that at one point, I mean, he sort of says it himself. He says, I always voted against climate change. That's nonsense. All I knew was Al Gore was for it, so I'm against it. And he said, and then I went to run for a second time. I was very successful. And my son came to me and said, Dad, I'm with you. I support you. I'll back this all the way, except for one thing. You have got to change your stance on climate change. Basically, I'm sure he said to him, because, it's my future that you're messing with. So you better find out a little bit more about this. And so he did. And he went, I think, where did he went to the Arctic, and he saw the glaciers melting. And what's that? And he met the Great Barrier Reef as well, right? And he went to the Great Barrier Reef and he saw that the reef was bleaching, and he really had an epiphany. And he did his homework, and he came back and he introduced bills, right, in Congress. And he said, I believe climate change is real, and this is how I think we can tackle it. And in the primary that he was running for, he got stomped. He just lost completely to his adversary, right?
Like he was in a super safe district as a Republican.
Exactly.
And then he got primaried and lost. Went from like 80% support or something. Wasn't it like, didn't he win like 80% and then he got like 30%?
It was terrible. And as he says, it was a spectacular faceplant, like he in politics. He just, but beyond that, and some of the stuff that's not didn't make it into the short, but is in the interview, he was ostracized and excoriated, and his family received, nasty messages. And he was turned on so quickly and so viciously that he's very brave, because in a lot of ways, maybe somebody else would have said, all right, I'm done. But he didn't. He became like the biggest advocate for sensible legislation, as he sees it, for climate change, and kept pushing forward on carbon taxes and things like that. And now it's interesting with the political environment that we're seeing today, because we're seeing a little bit of that, but he's still, in terms of like, if you buck the trend of your party, then you're in trouble. But he did it before it was popular in the environmental movement. So that's his story. And he continues to work for environmental education and climate change.
And his story is told as a bit of a cautionary tale, and it was a famous story when that all happened. I can't remember what years that was, 2012 or 14, somewhere in there.
I can't remember either.
Somewhere in there, because those of us who are working on like trying to get Republican faith voters to move on the environment as one of the ways to sort of soften their opposition to so many things that seem so important. It was like, well, there's a congressman who lost his seat to, he got primaried, and everyone's worried about that, right? That someone more on the political right, someone more conservative than you is going to primary you, and on the political left, with many Democrats, that someone more progressive than you is gonna make a run at you, and that is a real concern, right? Like they're really worried about this, and people saw those tea leaves and said, we're not going to get on the wrong side of the environment, and at least not use the language and not talk about it in that way. So I hear a lot of people saying things now around politicians around environment that Yes, we believe in climate change, but we don't think it's human-caused climate change, right? That it's part of the secular pattern that goes on, and then they talk about ice ages, and like this is just a thing that happens, and we have to respond to it. But what we don't need to do is to blame it on human beings and then to put in regulation. We don't need to constrain human beings because of natural developments. Is that right? Is that what you heard from as you did this work, that's become the compromise that certain religious people and especially Republicans are trying to push, that they can get on sort of the right side of the science without being on the human influence side of the issue?
Well, I think it's a generational issue as well, because I think that is true, Doug. But we also interviewed a really lovely group, really committed of young evangelicals for environmental action, and they have no problem with pushing back and saying no. And they're getting involved on the community level where these decisions are being made. They're involved on the national level in Washington, and even Bob, former Congressman Bob Inglis, he goes community to community. They all feel like from the grassroots level that science is solid, and everybody in their communities can see that their crops are changing or their gardens are getting slammed by weird freezes. Everybody knows something's going on, but so they're trying to take it back. So the younger generation, I think, is pushing back. But what is the old chestnut that politics is it 20 years behind the national conversation?
Time machine, yeah.
But we don't really have that time, right?
Yeah.
We do not have that time, at this juncture. So that's, I think, an important part that we tried to make sure was in the story as well.
Yeah. And that was helpful. I'm so glad that, the younger organized evangelicals, environmentalists are out in the world. Maybe I'm just becoming an old crotchety person, but I don't trust that generationalism is going to solve these problems, right? Because had that been the case, I think the hippie movement, and we launched the Environmental Protection Agency in like 1972, right? There was a whole young movement supporting this stuff, and it all got sold out during the 1980s and then again in the middle 2000s. So, I hope that there's just going to be generational change to make these things happen. But boy, it feels like there's got to be some better arguments and better engagement. Did you leave this whole project thinking, and Curtis, I'm interested in your thoughts on this. Do you think the religious narrative around the environment and climate has a chance to be different in 10 years than it is now?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. I mean, we saw how quickly things changed in the 2000s. So we know that belief and sentiment can change very quickly. Outside of the film, within the film, I think the stories of Bob Inglis and also Richard Cizik, leader in the National Association of Evangelicals for a long time, are instructive. And they kind of characterize it as a conversion experience, but I might almost call it a social experience. They met scientists, and if I can extrapolate a little bit, they realized that they were regular people, right? And so, one of the takeaways for me is that it's good to spend some time with scientists. There are many people of faith who are scientists, and they, what they do that's distinctive is they have a different sense of time in relationship to the earth. And most scientists are very careful about the kind of claims they make and the kind of data that they use to make those claims. So for instance, I spent some time a couple of years ago in Yellowstone in the winter. And one of the things that they've tracked is how many days of winter there are. Over the course of more than a century's worth of data, we're now looking at about 60 days less of winter. at that high elevation. That's that's something that you don't really get a lived sense of unless you're spending time with scientists in places that they know and they care about. And then it becomes a real human issue that you can have a conversation about, right? And I think that's important. And, one of the great things that the internet has brought, I think, is better public access to science. Like, go hang out with bird watchers who are knowledgeable about, the history of migrations in their region, right? And it'll impact the way you think about our impact on our places. Yeah. So, and that kind of human to human conversation can change the narratives that we live by.
Mm-hmm. How important did your documentary give you any insight into how important like leadership is on this stuff? Like, did it become clear to you that there are people who could really lead out and make a difference to sway important public opinion one direction or the other? Or does it feel more like, no, this is many voices. This is going to take a lot of streams coming together to form a river, and we don't really need to find individual leaders to advocate. We need a crowdsourced kind of movement. Do you have a sense about that from the work on the documentary?
I think, from my perspective, it is a crowdsource, many voices. I think the voices that we showcased, that we've already discussed, are Reverend Mariama, who is bringing the environmental justice component to this. I think this is just such a large thing that we're facing. It couldn't possibly be one leader. And they all say it's going to come from the grassroots of community. Yeah. We can't, because everybody knows how they're affected. And so if there's a vessel or a platform where all these voices can be, stand together, I think she says in the end, because there is a lot of interfaith, coalitions who are very much not just the young evangelicals, but in every faith. And you have Pope Francis with his message, about the encyclical on the environment. And so if there was just some way to bring them together in one platform, and maybe there already is, I'm not sure. We were trying to create that platform with this short piece as well, to show all the different diversity of voices,
But I do think too that we have to, all those voices in the communities have to come together. But it's a global issue from a leadership point of view. Yeah. If we in the United States can't take that leadership role and take back that leadership role and move forward with all the other nations that are pushing forward, then it has to happen too. Because it's just, it's bigger than us. Yeah, but that doesn't mean it has to be overwhelming or scary, because it can change. Like, we can change this. We can do this.
Right. We know it. And we've been talking about it for so long, right? And I know there's a lot of things we talk about, right? We talk about pollution versus climate change, and that's different than, those are different issues. So some people are very committed to pollution, but they don't really think about climate change. Some people are really into, we have to change our federal government and big corporations' use of fossil fuels and of plastics, because if you don't do that, the individual consumption is just not enough to turn the corner. And some people are really into gas emissions. Like there's just a lot of areas. This is talking about the environment, is like talking about science. It's an area of study. It's not a singular thing. Religion's the same way. It's not just one thing. It's all of these coming together. And I just hope that it felt like there was a movement in the early 2000s that felt like, okay, we're going to really tackle these issues. And then people would argue about the best means of tackling that. And, is it going to be wind or solar as an alternative, or is it going to be hydro? All this stuff that are like, yeah, that's really an interesting way. Like, what's the way forward? And then something feels like it changed. And if people want to know what that is, The God in Green documentary is a essential piece to understanding how religious communities and big money and oil all came together in some common purposes. And unlike a conspiracy theory, it wasn't a secret. They did this stuff right out in public, right? I mean, unbelievable. The hubris of just like, oh no, we're not only gonna say it out loud, we're gonna shout it from the rooftops. That's a fascinating piece of this whole story. So thank you to all three of you and all the others who worked on this project. Any final words for the good people about this topic or about this documentary?
Go, Curtis.
Please tune in and see it. Yes, well,
watch it.
Please see it, and we'll make sure that Vote Common Good listeners and viewers have easy access to the film, and there's some other resources there that are available too. And if you have questions and comments about it, feel free to contact us, and let's keep the conversation going. That's what we made the film for too.
Well, great. That's Curtis
promote
Schaefer. You can
conversation.
find out all the good things going on in the. I think this is such a fascinating center that you run, the Religion, Race, and Democracy Center. I had documentary and democracy mixed up in my brain there, and they used a documentary to talk about religion, race, and democracy, and that's great. And Catherine and Janine make great films. If you haven't seen American Heretics yet, you should. And if you haven't watched this film yet, you'll be glad that you did. Catherine and Janine, are you working on anything else that we need to keep a slot in our documentary watching schedule open for? Do you have something coming in the future?
We'll let you know. Fingers crossed.
Okay.
on the Constitution and the rise of police power, based on a little-known 16th century English law that is kind of the basis of the unregulated use in which basically anybody can be arrested at any time for any reason. So we are working hard to bring that one to the screen.
Well, thank you. That's another important topic. You guys do great work. Well, thanks all for being with us here on the Vote Common Good Daily Podcast. Tomorrow, our Friday with astrophysicist Paul Wallace, where we talk about common good science. So a great lead-in from this topic into all things science. And be sure to subscribe. And if you have any messages for us, you can send a note over to podcast@votecommongood.com. So, Curtis, Catherine, Janine, thanks again for being on with us today.
Thank you, Doug.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.